The morning started like any other. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm, golden light across the quiet suburban street. Birds chirped lazily in the trees, and the faint hum of distant traffic reminded everyone that the day had begun. In one particular house, the backyard pool glistened under the early sunlight, a calm blue mirror reflecting the sky. The homeowner, a man in his 40s, stepped onto the patio with a cup of coffee in hand, taking a deep breath as he looked over the water. It had been a long summer, and the pool had been used almost every day. But now, it was time for maintenance time, to drain the pool and clean it thoroughly before the weather changed. He knew it wasn't a small task, but it was one that had to be done. He set the coffee down on the edge of the pool, rolled up his sleeves, and started preparing the equipment. There was a pump to set up, hoses to connect, and a filter to handle. It was all routine for him. He had drained pools before, and he enjoyed taking care of things himself rather than paying someone else. As he worked, he hummed quietly, feeling the satisfaction that came with handling a project and knowing it would be done right. He was aware that neighbors sometimes peeked over fences, curious about what anyone was doing, but he didn't mind. He had always respected other people's privacy, and he assumed they respected his. Not long after he started, movement caught his eye from the corner of the backyard. One of the neighbors, a woman who lived in the house directly next door, had come out onto her porch. She leaned on the railing, her arms crossed, her expression tightening as she watched him. There was something in the way she stood, something rigid and tense, that made him pause. He waved politely. "Good morning," he called out, smiling, but she didn't return the greeting. Instead, she glared, and for a moment he felt the energy shift in the air. Like the sudden stillness just before a storm, he shrugged it off, thinking she might be busy or in a bad mood. Draining a pool wasn't an unusual thing after all. People did it all the time. But as the minutes passed and the water level began to drop, he noticed that her eyes were still fixed on him. Every movement he made, every twist of the hose, every turn of the valve seemed to be under her intense scrutiny. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something sharper, something accusatory. He tried to focus on the work, reminding himself that he had done nothing wrong. It was his pool, his property, and he had every right to maintain it as he saw fit. The pump sputtered to life with a low, steady hum. Water began to flow through the hose, disappearing into the drainage system. He knelt to check the connections, making sure everything was secure. The sunlight glinted off the wet surfaces, and the smell of chlorinated water mixed with the faint scent of grass from the lawn. It was peaceful, almost therapeutic, and he could feel the satisfaction of seeing the pool gradually emptying. It was work, yes, but it was purposeful work. And there was a certain calm in it. Then he heard her voice, sharp and cutting, carrying over the fence. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. He straightened, looking in her direction, surprised by the sudden confrontation. "I'm just draining the pool," he said, keeping his tone light, trying not to escalate the situation. "It's for cleaning and maintenance." He gestured toward the equipment, hoping it would make sense. "I do this every year. It's routine." Her eyes narrowed. "You can't just do that," she said, shaking her head as if he had committed some serious offense. "Do you know how much water you're wasting? And what about the neighborhood rules? This could affect everyone." She stepped closer to the edge of her porch, leaning forward, her voice rising just enough to carry the tension. He realized she wasn't listening. She wasn't interested in explanation. She was determined to be upset. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I checked everything," he said, "and this is completely legal. The city allows residents to drain their pools, and I'm following all the guidelines. Nothing is being wasted, and no one is at risk. I'm just doing routine maintenance," he smiled politely, hoping a calm approach would help, but she only shook her head harder, her lips pressing into a tight line. Minutes passed, and the water continued to disappear. He kept working, brushing the sides of the pool, checking the drain, and monitoring the hose. But all the while, he could feel her watching, her presence like a shadow over the backyard. Every time he adjusted the equipment or moved a tool, she tensed, ready to complain. It was as though she had made it her mission to intervene in every little action. He tried not to let it bother him, but he could feel the creeping tension. The way her eyes seemed to track every motion, judging, accusing. He had almost finished connecting the last hose when she stepped off her porch and walked closer to the fence that separated their yards. He paused, unsure what she would do next. "Do you even know the law?" she said, her tone now a mixture of fear and anger. "You could be fined for this. People have been fined for less." He shook his head, suppressing a sigh. "I'm following the law," he said again. "I checked all the regulations. There's no violation here. I'm allowed to drain my pool." But she didn't seem to hear him. Instead, she raised her phone, pointing it toward him. "I'm calling the police," she said. "This is outrageous. Someone has to stop you." He froze for a second, feeling a mixture of disbelief and irritation. He had never had a serious confrontation with a neighbor before. He had known disagreements might happen, but this felt extreme, like the situation had jumped to a level he wasn't prepared for. Still, he stayed calm. He lowered his hands, showing her that he meant no harm. "Please," he said, "just watch me finish. You'll see that everything is fine. There's no danger, no waste, no violation." But she didn't lower her phone. Instead, she marched back to her porch, dialing quickly as she muttered about rules and permits. He could hear snippets of her conversation through the air, her words urgent and sharp, as if she were describing a crime rather than ordinary pool maintenance. The homeowner shook his head, trying to focus on the task. He had come outside early to handle this quietly, to get the work done before the day got busy. Now, he realized, it was going to be anything but quiet. Every turn of the valve, every movement of the water was being scrutinized. The air felt heavier, filled with tension that had nothing to do with the pool itself. It was strange, he thought. How quickly a simple task could turn into a confrontation simply because someone misunderstood it or refused to understand it. He continued working, brushing the sides of the pool, checking the water flow, making sure the pump was running smoothly. The water level was dropping steadily, and he could see the bottom of the pool emerging slowly. It was a visual reward, proof that the work was progressing. And yet, the shadow of the neighbor's presence lingered. Her phone in hand, her stance rigid, waiting for some misstep to justify her complaint. He realized that she wasn't just worried about the pool. She was invested in controlling what happened around her, even if it made no sense. Hours passed, and the backyard began to change. The water was almost gone, leaving a shallow puddle at the bottom. The pool, which had been a deep blue mirror of the sky, was now a bare surface, ready for cleaning and repair. He felt a sense of accomplishment, a quiet pride in handling the project himself. And yet, the tension remained. From across the fence, he could see the neighbor pacing, muttering into her phone, her eyes sharp and accusatory. It was clear that she wasn't done, that she had already decided how this story would unfold. Regardless of the facts, finally, the pump finished its job. The last of the water drained, leaving the pool empty. He turned off the equipment, wiping his hands on a towel, trying to shake off the anxiety that had built up over the confrontation. He looked toward the neighbor, who was still on her porch, phone in hand, talking rapidly. It was clear that she was calling the authorities, reporting him for something he had not done. The homeowner felt a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He had expected a normal, quiet morning of maintenance. Instead, he had stepped into a drama that seemed both unnecessary and absurd as he began to clean up his tools. He thought about how quickly ordinary actions could spiral when communication broke down. He had been careful, respectful, and completely within his rights. Yet here he was, facing anger and accusations from someone who refused to understand the situation. It was a lesson in patience, he realized, and in standing firm without escalating conflict. Sometimes, he thought, simply had to do what was right and let others see for themselves. By the time the afternoon sun had fully risen, the backyard was quiet again. The pool sat empty, ready for the next phase of cleaning. The homeowner took a deep breath, stepping back to look at his work. He knew the confrontation wasn't over, that the neighbors' calls would bring others into the story soon enough. But for now, there was a small moment of calm. It's a moment to reflect on the simple satisfaction of completing a task and doing it correctly. He poured another cup of coffee and leaned against the fence, watching as life continued around him. The drama would come, yes, but he felt ready. He had stayed calm, handled everything with care, and done the right thing. That, he thought, was all anyone could do. The neighbor's phone call changed the atmosphere almost instantly. What had started as a quiet morning of maintenance now began to feel heavier, charged with tension that wasn't there before. The homeowner, still wiping his hands from the pool cleaning, noticed her pacing back and forth on her porch, phone pressed tightly to her ear. He could hear bits of her conversation even though she tried to speak quietly. Her words were sharp and urgent. "He's draining the pool illegally. Someone needs to come now. You don't understand. This is serious. It's affecting the neighborhood." He shook his head in disbelief. She wasn't just upset. She seemed convinced that she was right, that she had uncovered some kind of wrongdoing. He tried to tell himself that people could be like that some neighbors just had a hard time letting things go. Still, hearing her talk like she was reporting a crime made him realize how far this was going to go. He had to stay calm. He reminded himself that he was doing everything properly, that he had all the paperwork and knowledge needed to show he was within his rights. As he began moving his tools back to the shed, she suddenly appeared at the fence, leaning over and staring down at him. Her eyes were sharp, almost daring him to respond. "Do you even care about the rules?" she demanded. "This could get you in trouble. Don't you see what you're doing?" He stopped in his tracks, took a deep breath, and raised his hand slightly in a peaceful gesture. "I've checked everything," he said calmly. "This is legal, and I'm following the city's rules. The pool is mine, and I have every right to maintain it. I'm not harming anyone." Her face twisted into a look of disbelief. "Legal," she repeated. "You think this is just legal? Do you know how much water this wastes? And what about the people around you? This affects all of us." She gestured wildly toward the street, toward the houses on either side. It wasn't clear how she thought. Draining a private pool could harm the neighborhood, but she was convinced, and nothing he said seemed to reach her. The homeowner tried a different approach. He smiled politely and stepped closer to the fence, hoping to diffuse the tension. "Listen," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I understand you're worried, but you don't have to be. This is routine maintenance. I'm careful with the water. Everything I do is safe and follows the rules. You can even come over and check if you like." She snorted in disbelief, clearly uninterested in actually seeing proof. "I don't need to check. I know this is wrong, and someone needs to stop it. If you won't, I will." She raised her phone again and started typing rapidly. The homeowner felt a mix of frustration and pity. It wasn't just anger she was feeling. It was fear behind it. Irrational though it might have been, fear often made people act in extreme ways, he thought. He went back to the pool, finishing the last little adjustments on the pump. The water was almost gone, and he wanted to complete the task before things escalated further. But every movement was being watched. He could feel her presence pressing down, like a weight he couldn't escape. She was muttering to herself now, sometimes in audible bursts, sometimes in whispers, pacing on her porch like she was preparing for a battle. A few minutes later, he heard a new sound, the low hum of a car engine turning into the driveway across the street. He looked up just in time to see another neighbor approaching, a friendly man who usually waved whenever they passed. But today, the expression on his face was cautious, almost nervous. He stopped at the fence line, looking back and forth between the homeowner and the neighbor on the porch. "Is everything okay?" he asked hesitantly. The homeowner gave a small smile. "Yes," he said, "just routine pool maintenance. Nothing to worry about." But before he could explain further, the first neighbor started speaking again, her voice rising sharply. "See? He's lying. You have to understand this is wrong. Calling the police if he doesn't stop immediately is a serious violation." The friendly neighbor glanced at him and raised an eyebrow. "Violation?" repeated, sounding confused. "I mean, it's just a pool, right?" The homeowner nodded. "Exactly," he said. "I'm doing everything legally. There's nothing illegal here." The tension built like electricity in the air. By now, a few other neighbors had started noticing the commotion. Some were curious, others were cautious, keeping their distance, but everyone could feel that something unusual was happening. The woman was pacing now, phone to her ear, speaking rapidly, describing the situation as though it were a crime scene. He sighed quietly, shaking his head. He had never experienced anything like this before. Draining a pool had always been a simple, routine task, something that required patience, effort, and care. He had done it carefully, ensuring that nothing was wasted, that the water went where it was supposed to, and that no property was damaged. And yet here he was. Being confronted with irrational anger and accusations, he decided to focus on finishing the task, hoping that once the pool was empty and cleaned, the neighbor would calm down. He returned to the hose, checking that the final drainage was running smoothly. The sound of the water flowing out was oddly soothing, steady reminder that the work was progressing, that despite the tension, the task was under control. The first neighbor suddenly stepped off her porch and began walking toward him, phone still pressed to her ear. "Do you even understand what you're doing?" she demanded, her tone sharp and insistent. "This is wrong. Someone has to stop you. I've already explained everything." He raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I understand perfectly," he said calmly. "I'm not harming anyone. This is routine. I'm following the law. There's no reason for concern." But she ignored him, focusing entirely on the story she was telling over the phone. Her voice was frantic, full of exaggerated urgency, making the situation feel far more serious than it really was. He realized that no matter what he said, she had already made up her mind. It wasn't about the truth anymore. It was about her perception of control, about being the person who dictated what could or couldn't happen in the neighborhood. A few minutes later, he heard the distinct sound of sirens in the distance. His stomach dropped. He hadn't anticipated this. He had never expected the situation to escalate to involve law enforcement. He looked toward the street, seeing a police car slowly pulling up, lights flashing softly in the afternoon sun. The friendly neighbor from earlier gave him a sympathetic glance. "Looks like it's about to get serious," he said quietly. The homeowner took a deep breath, set down his towel, wiped his hands, and approached the driveway calmly. He wanted to handle this with patience and reason, hoping that once the officers understood the situation, the misunderstanding would end. The woman on the porch looked triumphant, holding her phone out as if presenting evidence to the arriving authorities. When the police officers stepped out of their vehicle, the first neighbor rushed forward, pointing at the homeowner and speaking rapidly. "He's draining his pool illegally. You need to stop him. It's dangerous. He's breaking the rules." The homeowner stayed calm, stepping slightly back to give space. "Officers," he said politely, "I'm doing routine pool maintenance. I've checked all the regulations, and there's no violation here. Everything I'm doing is completely legal, and I'm careful with the water. You can see for yourself." The officers exchanged glances, listening to both sides. The first neighbor spoke quickly, repeating her claims with urgency, trying to convince them that a serious crime was in progress. The homeowner simply waited, letting the facts speak for themselves. He calmly explained the process, showed the equipment, and outlined the steps he had taken to ensure nothing was wasted or harmful. As the officers examined the scene, it became clear that the homeowner was right. The pump was connected correctly, the water was draining safely, and there was no danger to the neighborhood. The paperwork he had prepared confirmed that he was following the rules. The officers nodded, turning to the first neighbor with a professional but firm tone. "Ma'am," one officer said, "draining a private pool, in accordance with local regulations, is completely legal. There's no violation here." Her face fell, the certainty she had felt moments ago collapsing. But she started, trying to find another angle, but the officer raised a hand politely to stop her. "Please," he said, "we understand your concern, but there is no legal basis for this complaint. If you have further concerns, we suggest handling them directly with the homeowner in a calm and civil manner. Calling the police unnecessarily can waste resources." The homeowner felt a wave of relief wash over him. It stayed calm, presented the facts, and the truth had won the day. He glanced at the remaining water in the pool, which was nearly gone, reflecting the sun like a small promise of normalcy returning. The neighbor, on the other hand, retreated back onto her porch, muttering under her breath, clearly embarrassed and frustrated that her complaints had not produced the result she wanted. Other neighbors watching from their yards exchanged looks of disbelief, shaking their heads quietly at the unusual drama that had unfolded. The police officers gave one last glance around, satisfied that there was no issue, and left. The homeowner returned to his work, finishing the final cleanup. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, replaced by a quiet calm that had been missing for hours. He realized once again that patience and a steady approach could resolve even the most irrational confrontations. By late afternoon, the pool was completely empty, the equipment stored neatly, and the homeowner could finally sit and breathe. The first neighbor avoided eye contact, her phone now idle, as if the afternoon's excitement had drained her energy. The homeowner reflected on how quickly ordinary life could be disrupted by someone's assumptions and fear. But he also felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing he had handled the situation calmly, respectfully, and correctly. For now, the backyard was quiet. The pool empty, but ready for the next steps, and the homeowner could finally enjoy a moment of peace. He knew there might still be tension in the neighborhood in the days to come, but for now, the storm had passed, and he had navigated it with dignity, patience, and a steady hand. By the time the police arrived, the backyard was buzzing with tension. The homeowner stood calmly near the pool, wiping his hands with a towel, while the first neighbor, the phone still clutched tightly, was pacing back and forth, clearly determined to prove her point. A few other neighbors had gathered, curious about the commotion, peeking over fences and porches, whispering to one another in confusion. The sun was high now, casting bright light on the empty pool and reflecting off the homeowner's tools. It should have been a peaceful afternoon, but instead it felt like the calm before a storm. The two officers stepped out of their car, hands at their sides, surveying the scene with professional eyes. One officer approached the homeowner first, nodding politely. "Afternoon, sir. We received a call about your pool. Can you explain what's happening here?" The homeowner nodded, taking a steadying breath. "Of course. I'm draining the pool for routine maintenance. It's an annual process, completely legal. I've followed all city guidelines, made sure the water is disposed of safely, and there's no risk to anyone." He gestured toward the hoses and pump, hoping to demonstrate the setup clearly. "You can check everything yourself if you like." The first neighbor, however, immediately jumped in. "No, you don't understand. This is dangerous. He's breaking the rules. I've been watching this for hours. You need to stop him." She gestured wildly toward the homeowner, her voice rising with every word. "This could hurt the neighborhood. Someone has to do something." The officers exchanged glances, one of them raising an eyebrow at the intensity of the claims. The homeowner stood quietly, letting the officers listen, knowing that shouting back would only make the situation worse. He calmly waited for them to investigate. Patience, he reminded himself, was the best approach. The officers began inspecting the pool area. One checked the hoses, ensuring they were attached correctly and that the water was being drained safely into the proper drainage system. The other spoke with the homeowner, asking questions about the maintenance schedule, permits, and safety precautions. The homeowner answered clearly and politely, showing the paperwork he had kept in case of a dispute. "Everything appears to be in order," the first officer said after a few minutes. "The pool is being drained according to regulations, and there's no sign of a violation." "Where's the water going?" The homeowner pointed to the hose leading to the drainage system. "It's going directly to the approved area. I've double-checked all the connections. No water is being wasted, and no property is being affected. This is standard procedure." The first neighbor, seeing that the officers were listening to him, started speaking even faster. "No, you don't understand. He's lying. He's breaking the rules. You need to stop this immediately. The whole neighborhood could be affected." Her hands were shaking now, and her face was red with frustration. She looked around at the neighbors who had gathered, as if needing witnesses to back her claims. One of the officers raised a hand calmly. "Ma'am, please. We're looking at the facts. We need to see evidence before making any decisions. Let's keep this calm so we can understand what's happening." She huffed in disbelief, but continued muttering under her breath, clearly annoyed that she was being asked to wait. The homeowner stayed calm, focusing on explaining the process in detail. He showed the equipment again, walked the officer through the steps he had taken to ensure the water flowed safely, explained the timing and method of drainage. Every point was clear, every answer precise. The officer nodded, taking notes and glancing at the paperwork. "It seems everything is as it should be. "This is routine maintenance, not a violation," he said. The first neighbor, however, wasn't ready to give up. She stepped closer, pointing at the emptying pool. "This is wrong. You don't see the bigger picture. This could cause problems. I've seen people fined for less. Someone has to take action." The homeowner, feeling the tension rise but keeping his voice steady, replied, "I understand you're concerned, but I assure you, there's nothing illegal here. I've followed all the regulations. You can verify this with the documents I've provided and by observing the equipment. There is no harm being done." One of the officers nodded. "We're doing exactly that. Sir, you've been cooperative, and it appears you are complying with all rules." "Ma'am, your concern is noted, but there is no legal basis for stopping the homeowner." The neighbor's face tightened, and she muttered something under her breath, clearly frustrated. The homeowner could see the anger and embarrassment in her expression, but he remained calm. He knew that getting upset wouldn't help. The officers had already heard the facts. That was what mattered. "Everything checks out," the second officer said after a few minutes of examining the drainage setup and equipment. "The homeowner is following the guidelines. There is no violation. The water is being handled correctly, and no one else's property is affected." The first neighbor's jaw tightened, and she took a step back. "But this is unfair. I can't believe you're letting this happen." The officer spoke firmly, but politely. "Ma'am, it's legal. There is no action needed on our part. If you have concerns in the future, we suggest addressing them calmly with the homeowner or contacting the city for guidance. Making unfounded reports to emergency services can cause unnecessary strain." The woman's phone slipped slightly from her hand as she realized the officers were not going to intervene. Her eyes darted around, searching for some support from the other neighbors. But most were shaking their heads or watching silently. She muttered one last complaint, then stepped back toward her porch. Clearly frustrated and embarrassed, the homeowner exhaled quietly, relief flooding him. The tension that had been building for hours slowly began to fade. He returned to the pool area, checking the hoses one last time to ensure everything was secure. The water was almost gone, and the empty pool reflected the sunlight like a calm mirror. The officers gave one final glance around, satisfied that there was no problem. "Everything looks fine here," one said. "We'll be leaving now. Remember, sir, you are within your rights. Ma'am, please try to resolve concerns without involving law enforcement unnecessarily in the future." The police car drove away, the flashing lights disappearing down the street. The backyard finally felt quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed. The homeowner returned to cleaning up his tools, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering tension. He knew the neighbor might continue to grumble, but for now, the situation had been resolved with facts and patience. As he put away the last of the hoses and wiped his hands on a towel, he reflected on what had just happened. It was strange how a simple, routine task could escalate so quickly. He had been careful, respectful, and entirely within his rights. Yet he had been confronted with anger, accusations, and a dramatic phone call to the police. It was a reminder of how fear and misunderstanding could amplify even the smallest actions. The other neighbors who had been watching slowly dispersed, whispering to one another about the unusual scene they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads in disbelief at the neighbor's behavior. Others offered quiet words of support to the homeowner as he finished his work. He nodded politely, grateful for their understanding but eager to return to a sense of normalcy. The first neighbor, meanwhile, retreated inside her house, phone still in hand, muttering complaints to herself. Her face was a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. She had expected the police to validate her concerns, to stop the homeowner, but instead, the facts had spoken for themselves. The empty pool, the documented process, and the officer's calm but firm explanation had left her without recourse. The homeowner finally sat down on the patio, exhausted but relieved. The pool was empty, ready for the next phase of cleaning, and the tools were put away. He took a deep breath, enjoying the calm for the first time all afternoon. The sun was high, casting a warm glow over the backyard. He could hear birds singing in the trees again, the distant hum of traffic, and the faint laughter of children playing in another yard. Life was slowly returning to normal. He thought about the morning and the escalation that had occurred. It was amazing how quickly things could spiral out of control when someone acted out of fear and assumed the worst. And yet he also felt a sense of satisfaction. He had handled everything calmly, logically, and respectfully. He had not raised his voice, argued unnecessarily, or lost his patience. And in the end, the truth had prevailed, as he leaned back in his chair. Sipping the last of his coffee, he realized that patience and reason were powerful tools, even when confronted with anger, accusations, and drama. Staying calm and presenting facts clearly could prevent a small misunderstanding from turning into a major conflict. He felt a quiet pride in knowing that he had done just that. By late afternoon, the street had returned to its usual rhythm. Cars passed slowly, children played, and neighbors went about their business. The first neighbor remained inside, avoiding eye contact with anyone outside. The homeowner, meanwhile, had completed his work, enjoying a peaceful moment and reflecting on the day. The pool would be ready for proper cleaning tomorrow, and life could finally return to normal. The experience had been exhausting, yes, but it had also been a lesson. A lesson in patience, in standing firm, calmly, and in trusting that facts and truth would prevail. Even when confronted with fear, anger, and drama, the homeowner felt a quiet confidence. Knowing that he had handled the situation correctly and with dignity, no matter how chaotic it had seemed. After the police left, the backyard felt strangely quiet. The air, which had been thick with tension and frustration, seemed to slowly lighten. The homeowner leaned against the fence, taking a deep breath and letting the relief settle in. It had been an exhausting afternoon, full of accusations, pacing, and frantic phone calls. Now, finally, he had space to think, to reflect on what had just happened. He glanced over at the neighbor's porch. She had stepped inside, phone in hand, muttering quietly to herself. Her face was red, not just from frustration, but from embarrassment. She had expected support from the officers, validation of her anger, yet nothing she had said mattered in the face of facts. The homeowner couldn't help but feel a mix of sympathy and disbelief. Fear and misunderstanding had taken over her entirely, and she had acted as though she were the protector of the neighborhood rather than just a neighbor with her own concerns. Despite the chaos, he realized he had handled everything calmly. He had presented the facts, shown his documentation, and explained the process clearly. He hadn't shouted or argued. He hadn't reacted to her anger with his own. And in the end, truth had prevailed. That gave him a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had done everything properly, and no one could dispute it. A few minutes later, some of the other neighbors who had been watching slowly began to return to their routines. A couple of them waved at him from across the street, smiling slightly, acknowledging the drama they had witnessed. One neighbor called out, "Looks like you handled that well. Good job staying calm." The homeowner nodded politely, offering a small wave in return. He felt a little comforted by the support, even though he hadn't asked for it. It was reassuring to know that not everyone in the neighborhood had been caught up in the unnecessary drama. The first neighbor eventually stepped out onto her porch again, clearly calmer, though still flustered. She kept her distance this time, avoiding direct confrontation. Her arms were crossed, and she muttered under her breath as she observed the pool. The homeowner continued his work, checking the hoses and pump one last time to ensure everything was secure. He wanted to make sure that nothing would be left unfinished, nothing that could give her any reason to escalate again. As the afternoon sun began to tilt lower in the sky, he started cleaning the area around the pool. Leaves, small branches, and dirt had blown in during the hours of tension. Sweeping and tidying became a therapeutic process, a way to calm his mind and restore normalcy. The sound of the broom against the patio and the swish of water in the remaining puddle at the bottom of the pool felt soothing, almost meditative. It was as though the act of cleaning physically removed the stress from the day. The first neighbor watched silently, clearly still simmering. She had been confident that her complaints would lead to action, that the police would step in and validate her perspective. But she had been wrong. The homeowner had remained calm, professional, and respectful throughout the entire ordeal. Now, standing before the empty pool, she had no words left to challenge him. All she could do was watch and try to make sense of what had happened. Other neighbors occasionally peeked over fences, or slowed their walks to observe. There was a subtle acknowledgement in their eyes, a recognition that what had unfolded was unusual. Some whispered quietly to each other, speculating about the confrontation and the neighbor's behavior, but most seemed to respect the homeowner's space, recognizing that he had done nothing wrong and had acted responsibly. The homeowner, meanwhile, reflected on the lessons of the day. He realized how quickly ordinary actions could be misinterpreted. Draining a pool had always been a simple, routine task, yet fear and assumption had transformed it into a neighborhood spectacle. He thought about how easily misunderstandings could escalate when emotions overtook reason. Patience, calmness, and clarity had been his tools, and they had worked. He felt grateful that he had kept his composure. By late afternoon, the first neighbor slowly retreated inside her home. She glanced back briefly, her face a mixture of frustration and grudging acceptance. The homeowner didn't wave or call out. He knew that acknowledging her behavior wouldn't help. The best thing he could do was continue calmly with his life. She had faced the truth, whether she liked it or not. The police had confirmed the legality of his actions. There was nothing left for her to argue, as the shadows grew longer. He continued working, finishing the last cleaning tasks. The pool was now completely empty, the equipment stored neatly, and the patio restored to order. He took a moment to step back and look at his backyard. Despite the drama of the day, there was a sense of accomplishment. The work had been done correctly, and he had handled the situation with integrity. There was satisfaction in that. A quiet pride that couldn't be taken away by anger or misunderstanding. The day slowly moved toward evening. The sun began to set, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. The neighborhood settled into its usual rhythm, birds returning to their nests. A few cars passing slowly, children laughing in distant yards. Life was returning to normal, as though the tension of the afternoon had been nothing more than a passing storm. He reflected on the neighbor's behavior one last time. It had been frustrating, yes, but also revealing. Fear and misunderstanding could make people act irrationally. Some felt a need to control situations that weren't theirs to control. And yet, when faced with facts, truth, and calm reasoning, those behaviors could be tempered, if not fully corrected. He felt a quiet hope that she might learn from the experience, even if it took time. He returned to the pool. Sitting on the edge and letting his feet dangle near the empty water, he sipped the last of his coffee, enjoying the peace that had returned. The backyard felt like his again, free from tension and filled with calm. He knew there would be more work tomorrow, cleaning, refilling, and maintaining, but for now, the sense of resolution was enough. Occasionally, he glanced toward the neighbor's house, noting the absence of movement. It was clear she was reflecting on what had happened, perhaps questioning her assumptions or the way she had handled the situation. He didn't feel anger toward her, just relief that the confrontation had ended without further escalation. Life, he realized, was full of these moments, where patience and calm could prevent conflict from spiraling out of control. By evening, the sky had turned deep purple, and the streetlights flickered on. The neighborhood was quiet now, the earlier tension a memory rather than a present reality. The homeowner cleaned the last few tools, stored the hoses, and finally stepped back, surveying the yard. Everything was in place. The pool was ready for maintenance tomorrow, the patio restored, and the air filled with a sense of calm. He took a long breath and smiled, feeling a sense of closure. The first neighbor had lost her opportunity to escalate further. The truth had prevailed, and he had done everything right. He realized that standing firm, calmly, presenting facts clearly, and maintaining patience was often the most powerful way to handle confrontation. It wasn't about winning an argument, it was about letting the truth speak for itself. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, he sat quietly in the backyard, reflecting on the day. It had been exhausting, yes, but also educational. He understood more about human nature, now how fear, assumptions, and the need for control could lead to unnecessary drama. But he also understood the importance of staying calm, acting with integrity, trusting that facts would eventually prevail. By the time he went inside, the backyard was completely still. The pool stood empty, but ready for the next day's work. The first neighbor had retreated inside, the tension of the afternoon fading into memory, and the homeowner, having handled everything with care, calm, and respect, could finally rest, knowing that the truth had been upheld and peace had returned to his space. The events of the day would likely be talked about in the neighborhood for some time, but he didn't mind. He had faced the challenge with patience, and that was what mattered. Life would continue. The pool would be refilled and maintained, and the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood would return. And he would carry with him the lesson that calm, clarity, and integrity were far stronger than anger, assumptions, or fear. The morning after the confrontation, the neighborhood felt unusually calm. The sun rose slowly over the houses, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The homeowner stepped into the backyard, stretching his arms and taking a deep breath of the fresh morning air. After the stress of the previous day, the simple act of breathing deeply felt almost like a reward. The pool, now completely empty, glistened faintly in the early light, ready for cleaning and repair. There was a sense of opportunity in the quiet, a chance to put the chaos of the previous afternoon behind him and focus on finishing the work properly. He began by inspecting the pool carefully. The bottom was clean from the brushing he had done yesterday, but a thin layer of dust and dirt had settled overnight. He knelt and ran his hand along the surface, noting spots that would need extra attention. It was repetitive work, but it had a calming effect. There was a rhythm to it the way he scrubbed, rinsed, and wiped in for the first time since the confrontation. He felt fully in control of his own space. Across the fence, the first neighbor remained inside, her movements visible through the curtains. She was quiet now, almost subdued, though every once in a while she would glance outside. The homeowner noticed, but he didn't let it bother him. He knew she was still processing the events, still trying to make sense of how the police had sided with him, how the truth had prevailed despite her confident complaints. It was a small victory in a larger lesson about patience, calm, and integrity. As he worked, other neighbors began to emerge from their homes. Some waved from across the street, a friendly gesture acknowledging that the drama had passed. One of them called out, "Morning! Looks like everything's under control today." The homeowner waved back, smiling. There was comfort in this small acknowledgement, a reminder that not everyone had been swept up in the unnecessary tension. Life, after all, was returning to its normal rhythm.